white-headed woodpecker here in Eastern Washington. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors here, AJ Kroll from Weyerhaeuser. He's the kind of brains behind doing all the computer programming for the statistical analysis that I've conducted over the years with research, and he's co-authored quite a few papers with me that we published together. Excuse me. And then Kevin Lucas, he is kind of like he's a really good friend of mine. I call him my volunteer extraordinaire. I also call him my MacGyver, because if there's something I need or something he fixed or created, he can whip things up in his garage, and has helped me out a lot with my research, especially with the banding of the woodpeckers. So I'm the wildlife biologist, TFW wildlife biologist for the Yakima Nation, which stands for Timber Fish and Wildlife. The main portion of my job is working off reservation, reviewing timber sales that occur on the Yakima ceded lands. So I cover 5 counties here in Eastern Washington. And if anybody wants to do a timber harvest in the state of Washington, they have to submit a forest practice application to the Department of Natural Resources. Though all those applications that occur on the ceded lands of the Yakima Nation come through our office. And as the Timber Fish and Wildlife biologist, I review those applications and then address certain things such as species of concern or endangered species habitat, like the northern spotted owl, western gray squirrel, northern goshawk, things of that nature. So this research project I kind of do on the side, and I got interested in white-headed woodpeckers primarily because when I started my job and I was reviewing timber sales, this species was always referred to as needing old growth, large diameter ponderosa pine forests. But I kept finding them occasionally in these really heavily managed stands, like the picture on this title slide shows, that are really small diameter trees. And so I got to wondering, I said, well, how well are these birds doing in these managed forests? And so I started out with looking at one thing and then got multiple questions after that. So here I am 20 years later, still doing research. So today's going to be kind of a summary of those past 20 years. Okay, so the white-headed woodpecker, for those who aren't familiar with the species, this is what they look like. The male is on the left, and he has the red neutral patch on the back of his head or on the nape. And the female is on the right. She looks identical to the male, except there's no red patch. They are found all throughout Western North America, but primarily within Washington, Oregon, and California, and a little bit up into southern British Columbia, where they are considered endangered because of really, really small populations. And then there's a little bit in Idaho in ponderosa pine forest there. In the southern portion of the species range down in Southern California, there's actually a different subspecies called Gravirostris, and their beak is actually significantly longer, and their tails are significantly longer than the subspecies we have up here to the north. And that's believed to be an adaptation of feeding on larger seeded pine trees and larger cone-producing trees like coulter pine and digger pine down in Southern California. So why study white-headed woodpeckers? Well, when I first started this research project, they were one of the least studied woodpeckers in North America. And there had only been one study that was done in Washington, and that was in 2003 by a biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife looking at nest site characteristics. But now, after our work and with some of my colleagues, there are now 15 published research papers on white-headed woodpeckers, and we currently have one in review, and I'm working on another one right now that I'll probably be submitting in the next couple months. So you can see we've really expanded the knowledge base on this species here in the Northwest. As I mentioned before, this white-headed woodpecker was historically thought to be tied to old growth structure or very large diameter ponderosa pine here in the Northwest. And it's also currently listed, and was listed when I started this, as a species of concern in Washington because of potentially declining habitat. As I showed you, they do have a restricted range here in Washington, And that's because here they're dependent on one tree species, and that's the ponderosa pine. So they're only found east of the Cascade Crest, and they're only found where ponderosa pine is dominant or co-dominant with other conifers. Okay, so my objectives over the years were to focus on managed forests, so where there's been a history of forest management, describe their nest site characteristics, trying to figure out what kind of snags these birds were using for nesting. And snags also mean dead trees. Determine their reproductive success, because I was interested in knowing, well, if the birds are here in these managed stands with smaller trees, how well are they reproducing? So we looked at nest survival. I also collected data on parental provisioning, or basically what are the adults feeding the nestlings while they're in the cavities. And lastly, the project that I'm still currently working on is estimating adult annual survival. So I wanted to know how well these birds were living and how long they were living in these managed forests. Okay, so this is our study areas outlined in black, or filled in with black here, and they were in 5 primary areas in Yakima and southern Kittitas County and a little bit in northern Klickitat County. And this was in the Nile area, the Weenass, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and then Rimrock along Highway 12, the Altanum area, and then down near Glenwood in Klickitat County. So let's talk about nest survival. So basically we started out searching for nests. And we monitored the contents every time we found a nest with what they call a treetop peeper cavity inspection system. And what this was comprised of was a telescoping pole that could go up to about around 30 feet high. And at the end of that was a probe that we could stick inside the cavities. And on the bottom of the probe were 2 LED lights and a camera. And so it would illuminate the contents of the cavity inside and then send a video image to a monitor that was on the lower portion of the pole that didn't elevate up. And so we could see the contents of the nests up to about 30 feet high, which was a majority of the nests that we would find. So this would be an example of what a picture on the monitor would look like. These are 2 or 3 day old woodpecker nestlings, white-headed woodpecker nestlings, and then there's an egg there that didn't hatch. And then the bottom picture was actually there was an adult in that cavity at the time when we were checking it. So he or she was kind of checking out the camera, trying to figure out why this light was coming in their cavity. So you can see we have pretty clear, detailed images of what was going on inside these nest cavities. For each nest, we would determine the fate. So we would try to determine if the nest was successful, or if they fled, or if they wasn't successful, then we try to determine what was the cause of failure. When each nest was finished, we measured habitat characteristics surrounding the nest sites. And we measured a variety of different things, such as diameter of the nest tree, height of the cavity above the ground, shrub density around the tree. We had a whole slew of vegetation variables that we would measure, including canopy cover. And then when we were done, we hammered a blue metal tag into each one of the nest trees, and each one had its own individual number. So therefore, we could tell if a cavity was reused from year to year, and also by other species. Okay, for provisioning, we would use a Pentax spotting scope with a 10 power eyepiece. And yes, I would dress in full camouflage, even though the birds were aware of me, but it did help me blend into the environment after a little while, and the adults would eventually just forget I was there. And so I would sit anywhere from about 100 to 160 feet from a nest. And I began observations after the adults resumed normal activity. So many times I'd get to where the nest cavity was. I would set my chair up, the scope and everything. And in that process, the adults would see me. They would start scolding me, flying around. So I had to wait for a particular time for them to settle down so they could resume their feeding of the chicks. And that allowed me to get a more accurate representation of the time in between feeding intervals. And I always tried to view the cavity from the side or in a profile like this photo is showing. So that way I could get a clear view of what the birds were bringing back in their beaks for the chicks to eat. So I monitored cavities for during 2-hour time periods, and this was between 8 a.m. and noon. And I did this for each nest once when the nestlings were 1 to 13 days old, and again when the nestlings were 14 to 26 days old. For every visit that the adults came to the nest cavity, I would record the sex of the adult, the amount of time between visits that I recorded with a stopwatch, and if fecal material was removed, like what this male white-headed woodpecker is doing here in this photo. Every time they brought back prey, I would try to determine if the prey was small or large. So this photo here would be an example of a female white-headed woodpecker returning to a cavity with a small prey item because her bill is completely closed. There's no gap in between there. And this would be an example of a large prey item where the bill is noticeably open and the contents of the insects were sticking outside the bill. So the bird couldn't close its beak around the insect prey. Then I would try to determine the prey type to order. So this would be like for example, a beetle would be in the order Coleoptera, ants or wasps would be in the order Hymenoptera, things like that. Okay, so what did we find out when we measured the nest site characteristics? Well, here we have the variables on the left. So we had things like DBH, height of the nest snag, cavity height, slope of the ground, canopy cover, shrub cover, tree density around the nest, snag density, and then total stem density. That would be trees and snags. And so I separated out for this graph or for this table, burned habitat and unburned habitat, just to see if there was any differences in what the birds were choosing. And the only differences we found, which are highlighted in the red text, were that canopy cover and tree density were both greater in unburned habitat. Now, of course, that does make perfect sense. When you think about burned habitat where a lot of the trees are gone or killed off, so you're going to have a lower canopy cover of live trees, and you're going to have a lower live tree density. So that sort of made sense. But none of the other variables differed between burned habitat and unburned habitat. So what kind of snags were the birds using? So we have a type of substrate across the top, and then the species of the tree or snag that was used along the left. And so if you think of decay characteristics, and I'll show you photo examples of what these are. Type 1 would be a live tree, and then type 4 would be the most decayed dead tree. And here you can see that not unexpectedly, that ponderosa pine was the most frequently used tree species because it was the dominant tree in our forest. So 77 of the 91 nests that we monitored or that we found were in ponderosa pine. And these birds, although they nested in all types of snags with varying degrees of decay in soft wood, they chose the type 4, the most decayed type of snag, most frequently. So that was kind of interesting. And something that we actually kind of thought we might see, because white-headed woodpeckers typically are thought to be sort of on the weaker side of excavating into wood. So this here would be an example of a type 1 tree. So this is a live tree that was burned at the base and formed a rot pocket. And the little hole there is where the white-headed woodpeckers excavated a cavity. And you can see that it's quite close to the ground. And this did happen quite a bit. These birds are not averse to nesting, often sometimes within 2 or 3 feet of the ground. But this tree here, you could tell, you can see some of the bark is missing around the cavity entrance to the right. And that was actually from a black bear that tried to get into the nest cavity. But luckily the outer wood was hard enough that they weren't able to access the cavity contents. So that is one disadvantage to nesting so close to the ground. is it may make you more susceptible to predators. So this would be an example of a type 2 snag. And this is a recently dead tree. And you can see at the top, it still has brown needles on it. It still has all its bark and all its small branches. So this tree probably died within the last 1 to 2 years. And again, really close to the ground in the red box is where the cavity was located. This would be an example of a type 3 snag. So it's a little bit further advanced in decay. A lot of the small branches are gone. All the needles are gone. And some of the bark is missing off the top portion of that tree. And in the red box is where the cavity was located, kind of right where the trunk split there. And these would all be examples of type 4 or the most heavily decayed snags. And you can tell that aside from the one in the upper middle that was cut, all the other ones, the tops have naturally broken off. And these are the substrates or the types of snags that the white-headed seem to prefer the most frequently. And you can see here that the one in the top upper right, in that cut stump, that cavity was only maybe 1.5 feet off the ground. And yep, I think those birds were successful, I believe. So they can do pretty well nesting close to the ground. Okay, so what did we find when we looked inside the cavities? Well, they have a mean incubation period of about 12 days, and that was based on a sample size of 19 nests. And that ranged anywhere from 11 to 14 days, but on average, it takes about 12 days for the eggs to hatch. They have a mean clutch size of about 4 eggs per nest, and that ranged from 2 to 6. They fledged on average 3 chicks per every successful nest, and that ranged from 1 to 4. They have on average 1 unhatched egg per nest. And here's an example of that right here. This was after the nesting was complete, and there was still 1 egg left in the bottom of the cavity. So these birds usually begin incubation on the day before the last egg is laid. And so if a lot of the other chicks hatch first, sometimes that last egg that's laid is maybe either infertile or just doesn't hatch. And so we saw that that was a fairly common occurrence. And on average, about 1 chick dies out of the ones that hatched before fledging happens. And so if all of the eggs hatch and the last one was hatched a day later than the others, sometimes that chick is outcompeted by its nestmates and sometimes doesn't make it. Okay, so to determine nest survival, we were able to, we monitored 67 nests closely by looking inside the cavities, where we had a period of a number of days before the nest failed. But of those, we were only able to use 55 in the actual analysis of nest survival. And so that was between 2005 and 2010. We used a method called the logistic exposure method. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail about what that entails. But it's basically a 2-stage process of looking at nest survival. The first models looked at time variables, such as nest age, day in the nesting cycle, time of year, things like that. And the models for habitat incorporated all the habitat features that we measured around those nest sites. So basically, it's a 2-stage process. And what we did is we calculated a nest survival rate based on the whole nesting period, or what they call a period survival rate. So that encompassed 4 days for laying, 12 days for incubation, and 26 days for the nesting period, or for the nestling stage. So you can see these birds are in that cavity with tending to either eggs or chicks for about 42 days. So it's quite an investment, and it is quite a long nesting period. But that's part of that reason is because they're inside a closed cavity, so they're a lot more protected. And when the chicks fledge, they are fully capable of flight. So as soon as they leave the cavity, they are out flying around, following the adults around. Unlike robins and other passerines that build open cup nests, where they fledge before they can fly. Okay, so what we found was there was no time effect. So the daily survival rate, which is the probability of a nest surviving on a given day, was the same for every single day of the nesting period. So it didn't matter if it was on day 2 of incubation, whether it was day 5 of the nestling period, or day 24 of the nestling period. The probability of a white-headed woodpecker nest surviving was the same throughout the whole nesting cycle. So there was no time effect. So basically, nests earlier weren't more successful than nests later. But the most supported habitat model was only shrub cover. So out of everything we measured, deep diameter of breast height, nest cavity height, snag height, canopy cover, all those variables, the only one that came out as being significant was shrub cover. And on this graph, we have daily survival rate on the left and percent shrub cover on the bottom. And as you can see by the dark center line, that as shrub cover increases to the right, daily survival rate declines. So that was really interesting. We didn't know what we would find out with the vegetation variables, but apparently as shrub cover increases, the probability of a nest surviving declines. So that was really a kind of a enlightening finding from our nest monitoring. So the period survival rate at no shrub cover was about 79%. So a nest has a probability of 79% chance of fledging at least one nestling if there's no shrubs around the nest tree. So this photo here is an example of what that would look like. At 25% shrub cover, the period survival rate declines to 66%. And at 50% shrub cover, it declines to 48%. So the photo that popped up here is an example of a nest with a lot of shrub cover. And this nest got predated when the chicks were about 6 to 7 days old. And surprisingly, I think this is the only time this has happened. The adults nested again inside the same cavity, laid eggs, and the chicks got predated almost at exactly the same point, or somewhere around 6 to 8 days old. So they didn't learn their lesson, and they re-nested in the same snag and lost both nests. So what's happening with shrub cover? Why would that affect nest survival? Well, these birds have evolved in a fire-adapted landscape. So historically, about every 15 to 25 years, a fire would come through and remove all that shrubby understory. So because these birds are selecting well-decayed snags that usually have the top busted off, they're nesting closer to the ground. So that makes them a little bit more susceptible to ground-based predators, such as squirrels, snakes, weasels, things like that. So if there's a lot of shrub cover that's obscuring the ground, what we think is happening is that predators have an easier time reaching the nest snag and getting up into the cavity before the adults can detect them because of all that shrub cover. So that's sort of our hypothesis of why shrub cover is impacting nest survival so dramatically. And so we calculated an egg success. So out of all the eggs that were laid, about 50%, only about 50% result in a fledgling. Okay, so now what are the white-headed woodpeckers feeding their chicks? So I made a total of almost 700 feeding observations, and 349 were done by females, and 346 feeding observations were by males. So almost 50-50. So when we looked at small items compared to large items, both males and females brought significantly smaller prey items than large ones. But you'll notice that the difference isn't quite as dramatic in the males as the females. So males brought slightly more large prey items than what females did. Now, males are a little bit bigger. They have a little bit longer beaks, a little bit longer wings, and they are a little heavier. So maybe they're more capable of bringing back larger prey items than what females are. But the feeding rates did not differ between the sexes. So both males and females, when the chicks were 1 to 13 days old, they made approximately 1.6 feedings per nestling per hour. And that hardly varied at all, depending on when the chicks were older. So no difference in age. They fed them at about the same rate, and males and females also fed the chicks at the same rate. So again, almost about equal duties between the sexes. However, males made significantly more fecal removals than females, significantly so. So males definitely tended after the chicks more by cleaning the cavity than the females did. And so one thing I wanted to point out too is that males, male woodpeckers actually make great dads, because the males excavate most of the cavity for where the female lays her eggs. The males take turns incubating the eggs during the day with the female, but only the males incubate at night. And the males take turns with the female brooding the chicks before they can thermoregulate during the day. And males only stay in the cavity at night with the nestlings. So males, and they clean the cavity more often than females. So males make a huge investment into the raising of their chicks. And so that is one reason why they think that in terms of the relationship between male and female woodpeckers, that there's very little cheating going on or any kind of extra pair copulations, because the males invest so much in the nesting attempt. The females don't really have the need or want to go off and mate with another male and stay in an adjacent territory. So of those almost 700 observations, we were only able to identify the type of prey delivered in about half, about 54% of those. And you can imagine it can be kind of pretty tough to see what those birds are carrying in their beaks, because sometimes they land at the cavity and go in so quickly, you don't have time to really identify what they're carrying. And also sometimes it's just a wad of insects that's really hard to determine what they're carrying. So this is kind of a ranking of percentage of what the prey were bringing back to their chicks. And the top three there, the wood boring larvae, caterpillars, and ant larvae or adults, those were the top categories. And then kind of dwindled down a little bit throughout all these other insects. And that all other category included things like an antlion, a bumblebee, a crane fly, an earwig, things we only saw them bring back once. So they are fairly opportunistic in what they feed upon, but they definitely had their favorites at the top of that table. So we calculated what we call a niche breadth. So we wanted to see how wide of a, how narrow or how wide their pattern was for bringing back food. So if we had a niche breadth of 1, that would be almost evenly dispersed between all the categories, and a niche breadth of 0 would be basically 1 category. So you can see their niche breadth was almost about 0.28, or so pretty close to 0. So they are focusing on essentially 3 major prey items: the wood-boring beetle larvae, caterpillars, and ant larvae, and the adult ants. So those wood-boring beetle larvae are in the family Cerambycidae and Buprestidae, and those are the larvae of what we call longhorn beetles or jewel beetles, and they primarily feed in dead wood. So the adult beetles come in when the tree dies, lay their eggs. The beetle larvae develop in the bark, and they feed on dead wood in the phloem and the cambium. And sometimes they're in there for about 2 or 3 years before they leave as an adult beetle. And during the nesting season, the white-headed woodpeckers really seem to focus on bringing these back to the chicks. And there's the top picture there is a female returning to the cavity, and you can see that long white thing that's almost the length of her bill or longer. That's one of those wood-boring beetle larvae. So that's kind of like bringing back a Big Mac for your kid. I mean, they're loaded with fat and protein and calories, so they're great for the nestlings. And the bottom photo there is actually how they were getting a lot of these were actually out of the cut stumps left from previous timber harvests. So you can kind of see some of the sawdust there on the base of on the surface of that cut stump. The white-headed woodpeckers would seek out that sawdust, which is basically frass pushed out by the feeding beetle grubs, and they would dig into the wood, kind of make the opening a little bit larger, and then they stick their bill in there and they move their bill up and down like a sewing machine as they stick their tongue in and out. And they wedge their tongue between the beetle grub and the wood. And as they pull their tongue back, there's little tiny barbs at the tip of their tongue that face backwards, and it helps them pull the beetle grubs out of the wood. So they don't actually spear them with their tongue, or else they wouldn't be able to get them off and swallow it. But they use it to kind of work the beetle grub backwards to their bill where they pull it out of the wood. So it's kind of an interesting process of how they use their tongue for foraging on these insects in the dead wood of trees. They also fed quite routinely on spruce budworm larvae, where Douglas fir was present in their nesting area. And you can see by that picture of that female there, they can collect quite a few caterpillars and bring those back to the chicks in one beakful. And the ants included thatching ants as well as carpenter ants. And the carpenter ants, they really like to feed on in the springtime when the adult queens are leaving the colonies and looking for other places to go to. They'll actually fly catch for those adult female carpenter ants. So kind of a neat thing to watch. So we also looked at hairy woodpeckers at the same time we were monitoring whiteheadeds with the nestling provisioning, because we wanted to see if the two species differed at all. And you can see the stuff highlighted in green is where they differed the most. So hairy woodpeckers fed on significantly less caterpillars and winged insects. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever seen a hairy woodpecker fly catch anything, but they fed more on beetle adults and general insect larvae. So we calculated a niche breadth for them as well, and it was almost identical to the white-headed woodpecker, which was 0.28. The niche breadth for the hairy woodpecker was 0.29. So they're also focusing on just 2 or 3 main insect categories, including wood-boring larvae at the very top of the table with white-headed woodpeckers. So both species feed on them quite extensively to their chicks. So then we calculated what they call a Morositas index, which looks at the overlap between the two species. And a 1 would be complete overlap in their diet, and a 0 would be no overlap. So you can see that these two species overlap pretty well, or quite considerably, on the diet of the insects that they're feeding their chicks. So what does this mean? Could it be competition? Well, it could be. And one of the things we looked at was the nest initiation periods. Is this a way that they may avoid competing for food for feeding their nestlings? And you can see that the peak nest initiation for hairy woodpeckers in blue there is around the first week of May, whereas the peak nest initiation, or when the first egg is laid, not when the cavity is excavated, but when the first egg is laid, is almost 4 weeks later and towards the end of May. And this could be why white-headed woodpeckers feed a little bit more frequently on flying insects, which are much more available, as well as caterpillars later in the year, when they're not available early in the year when hairy woodpeckers are nesting. So differentiating their nesting period may be a way that they avoid competing for the same food resources to feed their nestlings. Okay, so this is what I'm still currently working on. We're still doing our banding project, but we have just published a paper on adult annual survival in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology. So I'm going to present those results here and go through how we actually capture and band these birds for studying them. So we did this only within the WENAS area of those 5 study areas that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So we only did this in the WENAS. I started this in 2011, and the results I'm presenting will go through 2021. So basically the first 10 years. And I've been monitoring currently 19 breeding territories. I didn't start out with that many in the beginning because I've gradually increased my banding and banding more birds throughout the years. And we did this in pure ponderosa pine. There may be a few scattered Doug fir throughout the area, as well as different trees along riparian areas, but it's primarily pure ponderosa pine, which has all been managed at some point. And again, a long history of forest management. So these are the red dots are all these dots here, are some of the territories I've been monitoring. You can see here, hopefully you can see my cursor moving around. This is North Weenass Road here. This is Malloy Road coming off at the intersection. And then down here would be Barbecue Flats Campground down here where it says Lower Milk Gate. So it kind of gives you an idea of where all these territories are located. And I've identified pretty much all the pairs in this area. And this blue one up here called Cow Canyon, this one burned this past summer in with the I can't remember what the name of the Cow Canyon fire is, this is exactly where the fire started, and it burned going east or going west to east, and it burned through the Cow Canyon territory. And then this area here is the Weenass Campground, and this is the Hog Ranch Road. So there's 2 pairs here, and then these here off the Mud Flats Road, all 4 of those territories burned this past summer with the Cow Canyon fire. So it'd be interesting to go back there this year when I start trying to relocate the banded birds again to see if any of these banded birds in the burned areas remain, or if they left the area. This one called E-Pass Front and E-Pass Road were salvage logged by Department of Natural Resources. So I don't expect there to be any birds left there anymore. E-Pass Back was partially salvage logged, so I'm hoping there's enough standing timber left that those birds, as well as the Mudflat Park pair, are still there. But again, hopefully I'll find that out this spring when I'm able to get out there. So how do we capture the feisty buggers? And I say feisty buggers because they can really peck your hands when you're holding them trying to band them. So the red box there on this dead ponderosa pine is where the white-headed woodpecker's nest cavity is. So this is one way where we tried to catch them, was while they were nesting in the nest cavity and while they had nestlings. So basically we want to catch them when they're bringing food back to the chicks. And we only did this when the chicks were 10 days or older, because at that point they're able to thermoregulate on their own. And we didn't have to worry about if we catch the adults, if the chicks would get too cold inside the cavity. So you can see, hopefully you can see, there's a pole going up here, and then this guy line, which is tied to the top of the pole to keep it tight. And then the net runs right here, right in front of the nest cavity. And so when the birds come back, they fly up to land and to go into the cavity, they don't see the net and they get caught. At least that's the goal. And it does work pretty well most of the time. The other way we would catch them were at these water stations that we would set up. So we would put these out in an area of their territory where we know the birds are going to be. We started out just by putting this bucket out here with water, but we found that the cows that are grazed there, as well as the deer and elk that are present, rapidly find the water and empty it too quickly for the birds to be able to use it. So I asked my friend Kevin, my MacGyver partner, and he constructed a cage to set the water bucket in, which allows the birds to move in and out of the wire, but the cows, deer, and elk can't get their head through to drink it. So that really allowed the water and it allowed the birds to use it for us to start trapping there. So this is an example of what the setup would look like. There's a pole going right here with one of the nets on it. So there's a net that runs out this way to about over here, another net that runs back to about here, and then a third net comes back up to this point here and forms a triangle. So we leave one end of the triangle open so we can get into the middle of it. But basically the water station is surrounded by 3 mist nets. And we position it where there's a couple trees there because the white-headed woodpeckers like to hitch down the tree, and then they usually hop right over to where the water is, and then they get caught inside the net. And this is a lot more time consuming. As you can imagine, trying to keep the water filled throughout the summer and then going in, setting up, because you have to stay there all morning until the birds decide when they want to come to the water. So it is a little bit more labor intensive. So we do like to catch most of our birds at nest cavities now because it saves me a lot of time. But when that's not possible, we do resort to putting out these water stations. So here's just a little 2-minute video for those who aren't familiar with bird banding about what's involved with taking a white-headed woodpecker out of the net. Well, that's me, by the way, taking the bird out, and my friend Kevin is the one filming it. You can see they get pretty tangled, and this bird's already been banded. It was one of our recaptures because we were trying to catch the female who was not banded. And there he's freed. Then we put him into a holding bag where we take him back and perform some measurements. So while we're doing this at the water stations, we do catch a lot of other species because they find the water just as quickly as the white-headeds do. So here we have a robin on the left and a Townsend solitaire on the right, a male Cassin's finch on the left and a chipping sparrow on the right, and a pygmy nuthatch on the left. We actually caught a lot of those this year. I think we caught like 18 this year, which is the highest ever. And then a red-naped sapsucker, which I think that was only the second one we've ever caught, so we don't catch too many of those. And then a Steller's jay and a western bluebird. So you see we catch a wide variety of birds. We band all them with just a regular metal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band that has all the identifying features on it. We take a few measurements and then we let them go as well. Oh, and red crossbill. We get those in years of heavy cone crops, and then a white-breasted nuthatch there on the right. Okay, so after we catch the woodpeckers and we put them in a bag, then we perform some measurements. So here I'm weighing the bird inside the bag, and then I'll take the bird out, and then my assistant will weigh the bag, and then we subtract the two to get the bird's weight. Then we band them with 3 colored leg bands and 1 metal numbered band from Fish and Wildlife Service. And each bird gets their own unique color combination of 3 colored bands, except in the instance of a mated pair where the male and female get the same band combination, because we can tell the individuals apart because the males have the red patch on the head and the females don't. But giving them the same color combo indicates that when we recite those birds that they were banded as a pair. Then after we band them, we measure the length of their bill. We measure the length of their tarsus, which is basically their ankle to their knee. And then we measure the length of the wing or the wing cord. Then after we get all the measurements done, then we try to age the birds. And this we do by looking at their primary coverts. So here we have in the red box is the primary coverts. So these feathers cover the primary flight feathers, hence the name primary coverts. And woodpeckers have a unique molting pattern in that the first year that they're an adult, so if they hatch, say in 2019, then in that fall, the juveniles molt into their adult plumage, but they retain all their juvenile primary coverts. So they're all kind of like a brownish color rather than black. Then the next year when they molt, say in 2020, they only lose or replace about half of those juvenile feathers. So one half will be brand new adult black feathers, and then the other half will be older juvenile feathers. Then the next year, say 2021, when they molt again in the fall, sometimes they will molt almost all of their primary flight feathers except for one or two hatch or older, browner, hatchier feathers. And so by looking at the pattern of retained or replaced primary coverts, we can age them all the way up to about their third year. After the third year, so birds that are older than 2 years old. So it sounds kind of confusing. Third year, you think they'd be 3 years old, but hatch year is the year they're born. Second year would be their second year of life, but they're 1 year old. A third year bird would be in its second year or third year of life, but they're only 2 years old. So hopefully that makes sense. So after their third year, when they molt, they replace all their primary flight feathers or coverts, and they're all jet black. And so if they're all jet black when you catch them the first time, you know they're at least after third year. They're at least 3 years old. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Sometimes it is for me as well. But it's a way that we can age them pretty reliably up until they're at least 3 years old. So that has a lot of consequences for determining adult survival. So here's just some examples of the color band combinations. I think we have like 9 different colors that we use. We don't use black because I found out that black blends in very well with their body plumage. So it's oftentimes very hard to see those black bands against the bird's feathers. So we don't use black anymore. But here you can see we have green and red and purple, and then white and green, and then fluorescent pink here. So when we read these band numbers, these band color combos, this would be the bird's right foot. This would be the bird's left foot. And so you read the one closest to the body first. So this will be red over green, and then metal over purple. This would be green over white on the left or on the right, and pink over metal on the left. So that's how we would read those in the field. So knowing your bird's right and left leg is really important when you're recording color combinations, when you're looking at them through binoculars. Okay, so then every year I go out in the spring and I try to recite all my color banded birds because I know where all their territories are and I know who should and who shouldn't be there. So this was a picture that my friend Kevin took when he was out one day, and this bird was green over yellow here on the right leg. So you can, even in a photo, you can see the colors. So we did this from March through July. We used call playbacks to find the birds because these birds occupy territories that are sometimes up to 100 acres or more. So trying to figure out exactly where they are on the landscape can be pretty tough. And I always try to maximize my time. So using call playbacks lets me learn where the birds are because they'll call often in response to me playing a call. And once I know where they are, then I don't use the playbacks anymore that day. And use just regular 10x42 binoculars and lots of walking. Sometimes I'm putting 17 to 18,000 steps on my Fitbit a day, trying to figure out where all these birds are in my study area. Okay, so 72% of all the whiteheads we captured were at water stations, and 28% were at nest cavities. And when I first started out, I'd say probably the first 5 or 6 years, we only banded at water stations. And it wasn't until recently I started banding at the cavities. And you can see here in this table that we catch a lot of hatchier birds, so birds that are hatched in the year that they're caught, and just almost equal numbers of males and females. And we were able to use 11 males and 3 females in the analysis. And that was one of the interesting things we found out is that a lot of our hatch year females leave the study area. And so that's why we only had 3 that entered the analysis, entered the population, because only 3 of them stayed around as breeders, whereas we had 11 hatch year males that stayed in the area and bred. And then the next age class that we catch a lot of are second year birds. And so those are birds that are probably nesting. Well, they are nesting for their very first time. And so those are often birds that have replaced other banded birds in our study area. So catching a lot of those 2 categories makes sense biologically. So overall, out of the, let's say 116 birds that we banded total, we're able to use 57 of those in the analysis of nest survival. So 33 males and 24 females. So for males that disappeared after holding a territory, they lived to a mean age of about 3.5 years. That was based on 19 individuals, while females lived to a mean of 3.86 years. So that wasn't statistically different. So pretty similar in how long they live before they disappear. And I say disappear because we really don't know if these birds are dying or being killed by a predator, in other words, or if they're leaving the study area. But because these birds are non-migratory, and meaning they stay in their territories year round, and they stay with the same banded birds year round, it doesn't make sense that a bird would just leave a known territory and wander off unless it is, so we think a lot of these birds are just perishing. They're being killed by a predator or something's happening to them, and not just simply leaving the study area. So our oldest males that we've documented were 9 years, 7 months, 9 year, 11 months, and 10 years, 11 months. So they're capable of living to a pretty ripe old age. And the oldest females documented were 8 years, 8 months, and 8 years, 9 months. And both of those were aged as after hatch year. So we didn't know a precise age on them. We knew they were at least 1 year old. So that's kind of a conservative estimate when they could have actually been a little bit older. So this is kind of a big complicated table, but basically the numbers in red are what we really need to be concerned with here. And that is that of all the birds that we banded and put into this analysis, we were able to recapture, there's about an 87% chance of recapturing them or re-seeing them on a territory. And there's about an 85% chance of an adult surviving from year to year as long as they've had a territory. So a pretty good chance at survival. I mean, you have an 85% chance of surviving from year to year once you have a territory and you're a breeder. So we weren't able to look at survivorship of young birds when they first leave the territory because we only did survival on birds that we knew were breeding in the area. And there was no difference really between age classes in survival. So age class 1 would be hatch year birds. Age class 2 would be birds that are at least 2 years old. And age class 3 are birds that are 2 years and older. So a slightly less survival for the age class 1, but there still was no statistically significant difference between age classes. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank all the technicians and everybody who was able to help me out over the years with nest searching, vegetation monitoring, and all the bird banding and stuff that I've done. The Bureau of Indian Affairs for funding, and these agencies for access to their land, and also to one private landowner. Okay, so with that, I'll answer any questions.
Okay, we have a couple in the chat here. Elaine is asking, says, when a burned area is cleared, salvaged for lumber, has there been an effort to leave in place some snags to a certain height to enhance nest cavity candidates for birds?
In general, the salvage logging that takes place. They were leaving in this area about 6 snags per acre, so 6 dead trees per acre after the salvage harvest, as well as some of the live trees that are still alive. But again, that depends on how hard the forest burned, because it burned really hot and almost all the trees died in certain areas. And then in other areas, the fire just kind of burned through the understory and there's a lot of live trees. So DNR, when they were salvaging, they left 6 snags per acre. And I think they were creating some where if they were going to take a tree, they would raise it up a little bit, the feller buncher, the mechanical device that cuts the tree, and then you make a short snag out of it as well. So definitely not as many as there would be if they hadn't salvage logged it. But they do leave an attempt to leave some of those snags. Yeah.
Okay, another one from Elaine. It is fascinating to know there could actually be a cavity nest made in a live blue elderberry. Could you describe that a little?
Yeah, it was obviously it was fairly small in diameter. I think it was maybe 7 or 8, maybe 7 inches, 6 inches in diameter. It was what I kind of considered an old growth blue elderberry. It was the only time we've ever seen one use them. And actually right after the chicks fledged, there was a thunderstorm that came through and the whole top of that blue elderberry fell off right above where the white-headed woodpecker cavity was. So I'm guessing there was probably some rot in there that enabled the birds to nest in there, but I haven't seen it since, and that was the only time. But yeah, I was quite astounded, and I get that comment a lot.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? I don't see anything. Well, that was a really professional presentation. That was really good.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of work, like I said, a lot of walking and a lot of covering the ground, but being able to study this bird and find out so many interesting things about it that people have never really looked at. It's really expanded our knowledge about how I make recommendations to landowners about leaving appropriate habitat or trying to meet some of the habitat needs for this species, because they are the keystone species here in eastern in the Eastern Cascades, because their cavities that they create are used by bluebirds and a myriad of other species. They're important at keeping forest pests under control, so they're considered a keystone species. So if we can try to manage for some of their habitat and keep them on the landscape during timber harvest and timber management, especially since there's such a push now for thinning a lot of forests that have overgrown throughout the years because of fire suppression and things like that. I'm trying to work with a lot of landowners to kind of keep some key habitat characteristics for whiteheadeds and other dry forest species, on the landscape. And that was the whole purpose of doing this research right from the very beginning, to be able to make informed management decisions, to help manage their habitat. So.
One other question: how many months of the year were you actually surveying?
Well, I try to get out there, depending on the year and the snow levels and stuff. I usually try to start by about mid-March to the end of March. And then I'm searching for birds on territories all the way through about May is usually how long it takes me to figure out where everybody is. And because there could be days I go out there to the same territory 2 or 3 days in a row and only be able to find maybe just the female, or I follow a bird around for 45 minutes or an hour and I only see one leg, and I mean, they're very good at hiding one leg from me for some reason. So it's often not just go out there, find the birds, you see their legs and you move on. So, and then, then we're banding during the nesting season and then a little bit into the fall. So it, on and off, I'd say maybe about 3 or 4 months out of the year, I'm working on them. And I used to do it a lot more when I was doing the nesting stuff, because that just took so much more time. But with the banding, I'm able to kind of focus in on a little bit smaller part of the project and also do more of my other job duties, which my boss told me I had to do. So
I'm impressed with your patience, because I know, if I try to photograph a flicker in a nest, if they see me, they will not go near the nest at all, I
Yeah.
mean, you could stay there all day long and they just, unless there's a really super hungry chicken there, they won't go near it. So it takes a lot of patience to do that kind of stuff. I know.
Yes, yeah, you definitely have to learn patience because the birds don't always do what you want them to do, and you know that. Everybody knows that. So
Right.
yeah.
Okay, this has been recorded, so people will be able to watch it afterwards. It'll take me a day or so to get it up. So thanks a lot for your help. Oh yeah, another question. Is it helpful for you to receive band reports?
Yes, very much so. And I've posted on tweeters a few times over the years. I posted to some of the birding groups on Facebook about my project, and because I know a lot of people go over to the WNAS and go bird watching, especially for white-headed woodpeckers and that. So anytime anybody sees any of my color banded birds, even if you see, you get a look at just maybe one or two color bands and you tell me kind of the general area you were at, a lot of times I can figure out just from that information which birds you've seen. And I've actually had some people send me photographs of one of my banded birds that I was not able to find on their territory. And they just happened to be walking through there, got some photos of it. And it was a bird that I was missing, all year long. And I would have no idea that bird was alive if somebody hadn't reported it. So they're very, very helpful. If you can't report them directly to me, you can always go to the USGS bird banding lab and fill out a sighting report there. And I will get that information. It comes right to me because it's tagged through the banding permit and the band number and the color combination that's associated with each bird. So not only will you get a certificate saying where the bird is banded, but I also get that information of where it was seen. So yeah, so band reports are definitely very helpful.
And one last question, where's the best place to go see them?
The WNAS.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That would be my guess. But I'm biased because I know exactly where a lot of the birds are and where they like to hang out. And I've
Yeah.
had people go there and I've seen multiple eBird reports, and there's like nobody saw a white-headed woodpecker. How is that possible? But they're very quiet. They don't make a lot of noise. They forage fairly quietly. So they are very easy to overlook.
Yeah, I know there's a few of them in the Leavenworth area, around in that area too, I know, so.
Yes, but like the WNAS campground area, the Barbecue Flats campground area are really good, and all that surrounding area are great. And like I said, there's at least 19 territories spread out throughout there, so chances of finding them there are pretty good.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Everybody have a good night.
All right.